Hey gardeners, welcome to Garden Up Landscape. This is my YouTube channel. My name is Amy. I'm the owner of both Garden Up Landscape, the gardening company, and this YouTube channel. And with me today, I have research scientist Andy Davis from Georgia University and the Odum School of Ecology at the University of Georgia.
Go Dogs.
And so we are going to talk today. We're going to have a conversation about monarchs. This is a little bit off topic from my channel because I'm usually more about gardening, but since these two issues are so closely intertwined, and butterflies are just one of my passions. So first I want to introduce Andy. He manages a blog and a Facebook page. Everything is linked in the description of this video, so check those out if you want to learn more about him or his research. He studies several species of animals, but for our discussion today, we'll be focusing on his research on the monarch butterfly. So thanks so much for meeting with me today, Andy. This is such a pleasure.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
You're so welcome. Okay, so for myself, I've always loved butterflies to the point of obsession. Sometimes when I was an older Girl Scout and eventually a troop leader, we actually had nicknames called camp names. And because it was easier for young kids to remember nicknames than it is real names. And my camp name was Butterfly because that was just what I really liked. As an adult, I've been a professional gardener now for over 20 years. And my favorite kinds of gardens are the ones designed for water-wise and native gardeners, which all use the same plants as pollinator gardens. And also my side community project for several years has been sharing seeds from my swamp milkweed. I've been giving away free packs of swamp milkweed for years. Over 1,000 packs, I think. I don't know if it's up to 2,000. I never counted. I just gave them away. But yeah, so that's been going on for a few years. And that should give you an insight into my passion and why this topic is so near and dear to my heart. So Andy, would you tell us a little bit about yourself? What got you into science and why did you choose the monarch?
Oh, good question. You know, I was one of those kids that was always picking up bugs and snakes and frogs. And, you know, my parents just knew I would be a biologist later in life. And as soon as I got to college, I went straight into biology and never looked back. And it was just one of those things that you just knew. And so I've always been passionate about nature, science. I actually started my career as an ornithologist and I studied bird migrations. And that was when I first realized sort of the parallels between bird migrations and monarch butterfly migrations. And that's kind of the thing that got me into the monarchs to begin with. And I started off studying the monarch migration. I've probably been studying the monarchs for the longest time in my career. Like, as you said, I do study some other things, including spiders, but the monarchs are definitely one of my main passions. And throughout my career, I've been mostly focused on the monarch migration, which is, as people here know, is a fascinating part of their life history.
It's incredible. Those little tiny insects traveling thousands of miles.
Yeah, it's a really important part of their charisma. What makes them so special to everybody is that crazy migration that they have.
Yeah, that's actually on my bucket list. Is the only reason I would ever want to go to Mexico is to see the migration.
It's definitely something to see. I mean, it is a bucket list thing. I mean, I've been there. People come up to the top of the mountains and they start crying. I mean, it's beautiful and it's something to see. Everybody should see it at least once in their lifetime.
Mm.
Yeah.
Except we don't want everybody to go there once in their lifetime because then we destroy all the habitat.
Well, there's that too, yeah. And there's a whole other conversation to be had about whether or not we should be doing that and whether it's good for the butterflies or whether the people in Mexico deserve the funds that come from the tourism. And it's a really complex topic, right?
Yeah, I didn't even think about the tourism thing. 100%.
Yeah,
Wow.
And there's actually some research that shows that the butterflies that are at the wintering colonies where there are tourists that come, they actually are in poorer condition than the butterflies that go to colonies where there's no tourists. It's a very limited study, but there is research that shows that it may or may not be good for them.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I could see I don't know about Mexican politics, right? But it could be like the same thing as the Amazon, where even though we're benefiting all the world with this space, if it's not bringing us any revenue, we're just going to level it and turn it into farmland. And, that would be horrible. I don't know if Mexico would ever do that, but
Yeah.
you never know.
Yeah, the situation in Mexico is always a complex topic. It's
Yeah.
it's not one that I've ever been focused on in my career. I'm more of the sort of the fall migration guy.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh boy. That went down a tangent I wasn't prepared for. So
But it's easy to do that with monarchs, right? Because there's so much research and there's so many different facets of their life history, and there's so many people studying them, and so that's one of the complicating issues we have these days with getting the information across, is that there's so much information, right?
Yeah.
And there's so much research, so it can be hard to keep up.
Yeah. And I think that's where I struggle, because like even I was doing research for a weed video a couple of years ago, and I pulled out, my weed book to make sure that I had the name right and this and that and the other, all the details. And then I had already Googled it, and the name had changed since the book was printed.
Yeah.
I'm like, wait, what? That can happen?
Yep.
It's hard to keep up on science for anything because it's just constantly changing.
Well, this is one of the reasons why I have my blog and my Facebook group is try to help people like yourself to keep up with the science.
Yes.
Because that's kind of what I do in my group is to keep people informed of what research is happening, what the findings mean. Because really there is no other way. There's no forum like that other than what I just mentioned. Like the science goes into scientific journals,
yeah,
but then it doesn't get to regular folks, right?
Yeah.
Unless they themselves read those journals, which no one does.
Right.
So
or the best we get is the headlines, which
these days are misleading often, and they're extrapolated, and so there's a lot of chaos and confusion in not just World of Monarchs, but everything on social media these days. And so it's hard for people like yourself and other people to sort of keep up and to stay abreast of the changes that happen. And that's part of the battle I've been fighting lately is to try to get the real message across.
Yeah, that's a big job. I can imagine.
It's huge, and there's also emotions mixed in with this, right? Especially with the monarchs, because sometimes people hear about a study that they don't like to hear, right? They don't like what the study shows, and so then there's pushback, and the people resist or delete the comments, then there's that's overlaid with trying to get the message across. It's people who resist and don't want to hear it.
Yeah.
So that's something I didn't really expect to see when I started this endeavor of the pushback, I guess.
Yeah. Well, and it's fascinating that you're out there saying, hey, this is good news. Monarchs aren't actually in decline. Look at these studies over here. And people are arguing with you like, this is amazing. But I mean, I can say for myself, the emotions that come up are, well, have we been lied to? Is my whole life's work was it a waste of time? Like, did I just waste my life because it wasn't needed? Like, there's all this stuff. So we'll talk about all of that.
Yeah.
So
you mentioned the decline thing. Do you want to start there, or do you want to?
So I did actually prepare several questions so that we could kind of get through everything and stay hopefully within a 1 hour time frame. So my first is 1 second here. Just make sure that's okay. My first is, it's no secret that monarch populations at their overwintering sites have been struggling for years, and the counts for this winter were just released a few weeks ago. But Andy, you say that that's not the whole story, and that the monarch population as a whole is actually fine. Can you tell us what you found, and are other scientists agreeing with you, or are you the only one that's out there saying this?
Yeah, great question. So your last part first. So I'm not the only one. I would say I'm probably the only one who's willing to speak, openly about this, and risk the pushback. A lot of scientists don't like to get, name called by people for doing their job. But I do get that a lot. And ironically, it's for telling people the good news. And so the good news here is that, as we know, the wintering counts in Mexico have been going down. The counts of the size of the wintering colonies in Mexico have been going down. The same thing's happening in California, where there's some smaller wintering colonies there. No one's questioning those. Those declines are real. But at the same time, if you look at the monarch populations in the summer, like during the summer when they're breeding in the U.S. and Canada, and there's multiple data sets out there where volunteers have been tracking the numbers of butterflies that they see every year, and there's various different projects. If you look at those data from the summer, it's hard to find in the summertime, right? And I was part of a team a couple of years ago that looked at a massive data set from the North American Butterfly Association, which is a group of volunteers that have been tracking butterflies for many years. We looked at all of their records of monarchs across the entire continent during the summer, and it was 135,000 records. It was probably the biggest ever assemblage of data on the monarch numbers in the summer. We looked to see if we could find declines, and we didn't really. I mean, there were excuse me, there were places where they were declining, places where they were increasing, but if you put it all together, there was no overall decline in the population. If anything, there was a slight increase over the last 25 to 30 years. So at the same time you have these counts in Mexico going down, you've also got stable breeding populations in the summer. So if you put two and two together, that means that these wintering colonies are not the end of the world. Like they're even though they're small, the monarchs can rebound every spring given their high reproductive potential. So
Yeah.
a single female can lay 500 eggs if she has the resources. And so what's probably happening is that the monarchs are just rebounding every year, every summer, to recoup those losses, and then they go back up to a stable breeding population in the summer. So if you look at those numbers in the summer, you don't see any evidence of dire need to be saved, right?
Mm-hmm.
In fact, if you look at if you look at how the numbers of breeding monarchs hasn't changed over time, that means there has been no loss of habitat for the butterflies. If there were, we would see long-term declines in the summer, and we don't. I mean, some researchers will point to the Midwest, the cornfield areas, and to say, well, we have seen declines of milkweeds in those areas, and that much is true. However, those same researchers have then extrapolated those declines there to the overall population everywhere, and they said, look, we have to replace those lost milkweeds in the cornfields. But the NABA data doesn't agree with that. The NABA data shows there has been no decline in monarch numbers in the summer, even in the Midwest. So we've got these contrasting ideas out there, contrasting pieces of evidence. The one thing I'll say that sort of was kind of the icing on the cake recently was a new study from a couple of years ago that came out that looked at the genetics of the monarchs. And there's a way you can look at monarch DNA, and you can sort of infer from that DNA how big their population size is now and how big it used to be years ago, like decades ago. And that new study came out and showed that there has been no loss in the overall population size of the monarchs based on their DNA, which I think is probably the most important piece of evidence that we have that shows, yes, there really has been no decline. In fact, that new study showed that, if anything, there has been an increase in the overall monarch numbers in the last 200 years based on their DNA, which makes sense because 200 years ago, the forests in the east were cleared by settlers, which then created this vast landscape suitable for butterflies. Mm-hmm. And so, if anything, the monarchs are doing better now than they were 200 years ago. So again,
that's insane. I love it.
Good news for people to hear, right?
Yeah.
So so my thing here is that I've been trying to show people what the actual science shows, for many years, and trying to counter this ongoing narrative that the monarchs are in trouble. The monarchs are in trouble, and it can be challenging because people get wrapped up in saving the monarchs, right? People really love planting the milkweeds, and they love, rearing the butterflies, and they just love the idea of saving the monarchs, and it gives them purpose. It helps them deal with all of the calamities and the ecological disasters out there, and it's like something you can do for the world, right?
Yeah, it's the little, I can do my little piece.
Yeah. And then here's this mean scientist who comes in and says, wait a minute, they may not have needed to be saved, right? And so people get mad at me for telling them good news.
Yeah, absolutely.
So but if there is bad news here, right? There is some bad news. I mean, the counts in Mexico are already going down.
Yes.
And we don't really know how far they can go down, how low they can go. For all we know, this is how low they were 200 years ago. But just last year, in the fall of last year, my most recent project was another collaboration with my colleagues here in the entomology department here at UGA, where we set out to determine if there has been a loss of monarchs during the fall migration. Because if you think about it, if the numbers in the summer are stable,
yes,
the numbers at the overwintering colonies are going down, that must mean they're having trouble reaching the wintering colonies.
Yes.
And so my colleagues and I set out to test that very idea, and we found exactly that yes, there's been massive amounts of attrition or mortality, whatever you want to call it, during the fall migration over the last 17 years. And that attrition is getting worse and worse every year, to the point now where the monarchs aren't even reaching Mexico during the fall migration. Something is preventing them from actually reaching their destinations.
Yes.
And so if you think about it that way, the monarchs don't really have a numbers problem. It's not that we have too few monarchs. They have a transit problem. They can't successfully reach their wintering destinations like they used to. So that's the bad news here.
Yeah, that was actually my next question, is how can there be such a discrepancy? Are they just not reaching the overwintering site? Are they going somewhere else and we just haven't found them yet?
Well, that's also a possibility, right? Because we really only know about the colonies where we have always known them, right?
Yes.
And there are lots of places in Mexico with similar elevations and climates, and some researchers in Mexico believe that there are more sites that we haven't seen before.
Yeah.
This is another controversial idea, but it's completely possible that they are going somewhere else, or that more of them are going to Florida or other places along the Gulf Coast instead of migrating these days.
Which is its whole other problem. Yeah. Okay.
So,
okay.
Yeah. The bad news is the monarchs are losing their migration.
Yeah.
The good news is we're not losing the monarchs.
Okay. Yeah. Because okay. Wow, that's incredible. Okay. Is there? I heard a rumor somewhere about a tracking chip technology, but it just wasn't small enough yet to not affect their flight. Is that on the horizon?
It is. Yeah, it's been something that people have been working on for a decade at least. That's sort of the ultimate sort of tracking ability that we want to get, where we want to put a thing on a butterfly and track it via computer to see where it goes on a map. I mean, we can do this with birds now, and the technology is advancing year after year. We have satellites that are tracking birds right now, and you can draw maps along showing their exact trajectory in their flyway to where they go. And we're seeing now that when you do that, you're finding that some birds, even in the same population, go to different places during the winter, during their wintering periods, even if they start from the same place. And so we're finding now that the migration is much more complex with birds. And so it may be that this we'll find the same thing with monarchs, that there's some monarchs go this way, some go that way. And yeah, it can be, so that right there, being able to track a butterfly, a monarch, would be the ultimate goal here. Although that it does require some really, really small tracking devices. And there's been various different approaches used over the years with trying to do this. I don't know if we're there yet, but I'd say in the next 10 years, we'll probably see some breakthroughs.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
I can scarcely imagine it having a tracking device the size of one of those stickers, that goes on their wings.
Yeah. I mean,
That's
it's
amazing.
that might be the future of tracking. I mean, when ornithologists used to track birds by putting a little ring around their legs, like a
Yeah.
little metal ring. They'd let the bird go, and it had a number on it.
Yeah.
And if somebody found it later, they would report where that bird landed, and then they would draw a line on a map.
Yeah. It
Very
just flew in a straight line.
archaic, yeah. But that's kind of where that's the state of the Monarch tagging, right? When you
Yeah.
put a sticker on a butterfly, you let it go, you hope somebody sees it or finds it later, and you can kind of just draw a line. But that's very archaic in terms of being able, because now we can sort of track animals in much more finer detail.
Yeah.
In
Yeah.
fact, a lot of bird banders have basically just given up because it's no longer needed, because now we can put these trackers on birds.
Yeah. Oh yeah, absolutely. It's a lot better. Oh my goodness. Okay. Um, so I'm going to shift the subject in a minute of how we can actually help. But first, I want to ask a why question. And that is, why do we keep hearing that monarchs are on the brink of extinction if they are actually fine? Is it just clickbait because it's a hot news topic, or is it a distraction from something else? What is the motive behind this message?
I'm shaking my head because I'm still trying to figure that out myself. I've got a lot of guesses. I do know that there's a lot of money changing hands over the Saving the Monarchs campaign, right? Nursery growers who sell milkweeds to people, they want to keep the story going. I do know that there's some of my colleagues, I won't say any names, but some of my colleagues believe that the story about the monarchs being in trouble is actually useful. It gets people to plant butterfly gardens. It gets people to, donate to conservation groups. It gets people to volunteer their time, right? Good things come from people trying to save the monarchs, quote unquote.
Yeah.
That's and so some of my colleagues, they really do know the difference, but they're not willing to come out and say it because they think it's doing some good. And it might be that these new, like the government regulations, the government decisions to list the monarchs as threatened or endangered or what have you. It might be that those decisions are being sort of biased by that idea that this is good, doing some good. I kind of feel like it's not, though, because there are some not so good things that can come from people trying to save the monarchs.
Yeah.
Like planting non-native milkweed, which doesn't help them, which
Yep.
People do when they want to save the monarchs. They go out to the nearest store, they buy the nearest milkweed they can find. Here in the South, it tends to be non-native, and so people unwillingly then plant those in their yard, and then it ends up making more problems for the fall migration.
Yeah.
Same thing happens with people who want to sort of save their caterpillars that they find in their backyard milkweed,
Yeah.
right? Because people want to literally save the butterflies, and so they bring them inside, put them in a cage or a container, and they rear them to an adult stage, and then they release them, thinking that they're helping. But then the research shows that that's also not as good for them as well, because those monarchs that are released, all of our evidence shows that they're not as good as wild monarchs in the very thing that we need them to be good at, the fall migration.
Yeah. Yeah. So they're weaker and they're less likely to complete the migration. Is that right?
They have poor navigational ability. They're physically weaker. They're less smart. There's actually a study that shows that. Their migration success based on the tag data shows that they have a lower migration success rate than wild monarchs. So all of the evidence shows that they're just not as good. And so really, we shouldn't be releasing hundreds of thousands of these into the population every year, because what we'll end up seeing is a gradual decline in their ability to migrate. And guess what? That's exactly what we're seeing right now. A decline in the monarch's migration success rate.
Yeah. And so that includes even captive rearing outside. Is that right? Like if I were to find a caterpillar on one of my plants and put a basket around it or something, like one of those monarch cages.
This is getting into the weeds a bit, but here's the thing about doing that. You're saving that caterpillar from its eventual demise on that milkweed by a predator, or maybe it gets stuck in its own sap of the milkweed, or it falls off and dies because it can't crawl back, or like
Yeah.
this happens all the time in nature, right?
Yeah.
In nature, um, monarch butterflies lay 500 eggs on purpose
Yeah.
because
Only a
only
few
a
of them.
handful of them ever survive to the wild, to make it to the adult stage. That's what's supposed to happen.
Yeah.
Right? That's
Yeah.
supposed to happen. And that's what keeps the population fit and strong, and like only the strongest survive, that kind of thing. But when you take that butterfly, that caterpillar, and put it in a container, even if it's outside, you've essentially bypassed that important step, that natural selection event. And you've allowed that caterpillar to survive to be an adult, which may or may not have made it on its own.
Yeah.
And so therefore you've then released a butterfly that could be inferior in terms of its genetics, its fitness, its health, immunity, whatever it is.
And does that then add to the gene pool more
Yeah,
inferior genes that weakens
yeah.
the entire population?
Eventually, yeah, you end up leaving, uh, you end up watering down the gene pool, basically.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
you got to think of the scale of this, right? Because most people think, oh, it's just me. I'm only doing it for a few butterflies, it's not hurting. But there's hundreds of thousands of people in North America doing this. If everybody just did 10, released 10 butterflies, you're talking millions of butterflies, of captive reared butterflies being released every year over the last 20 years,
Yeah.
right? Every year. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, some of them may not pass on their genes, because they'll die during the fall migration, but some of them might. And so there's a real fear now, and it's not just myself. Other scientists have the same feelings that, we could be unintentionally harming the gene pool by all of these releases of captive reared monarchs.
That's incredible. Yeah, I know
Yeah.
when I first heard, well, it wasn't first heard, but it was a few years ago. I heard about, the monarch decline and all that, and I thought I should just raise a few, and then I found that there were communities doing that. But I know myself, I can't keep houseplants alive. Like, I'm too busy to remember to do things like water them, which is why I love native and xeriscape gardens. And I was like, I would screw it up. I would screw it up. So I never did it. And then I learned the science that it was actually harmful. And I was like, oh, thank goodness. I don't feel pressure that I'm not doing enough, because that's actually a harmful thing. And so that was actually a huge relief for me.
Well, it's good for you for making that leap, right? Because
Yeah.
a lot of people, this is where people think there's controversy, right? There's a lot of folks out there who really like rearing monarchs, and it's a hobby for them, and it gives them joy.
Mm-hmm.
Think they're helping.
Yeah.
But you gotta. I'm just telling people what the science shows, right? The science shows, all of our studies show the same thing. They're not as good when you release them.
Yeah.
And we shouldn't be releasing unfit butterflies into the world. I see somebody has a question here about what about responsibly raising monarchs free of OE?
Yeah. So this goes way deeper than just tropical milkweed and OE. You're talking about the actual gene pool, but let's go ahead and touch on that.
But that would be my answer to this question here. Responsibly raising monarchs free of OE. OE is not just the only problem with these captive reared monarchs, right? It's the gene pool.
Yeah.
Right? You're allowing those butterflies to escape predation, right?
Yes.
So that they can live. But here's the thing that people don't like to hear. They're supposed to be eaten. Monarch butterflies are tasty snacks for predators. No one likes to hear that, but their biological destiny, their role in the natural world is to be food for another bug or a praying mantis or whatever it is, right?
Yeah.
And then their energy then gets passed up to the next trophic level, and then so on, right? That's why, I mean, every insect is like that. That's why monarchs lay 500 eggs, because there's no parental care. They just lay the eggs and leave, and then hope for the best. But people don't like to see caterpillars being eaten, right? And people get really uptight about this. And this is where I think the Saving the Monarchs campaign is misleading people, right? When people hear the monarchs need to be saved, they think in their heads, I literally have to save these caterpillars. right, from the ravages of Mother Nature. And so, but I tell people the caterpillars are not supposed to be saved. And this is where there's some, especially if people have been doing this for many, many years, thinking they're helping, right? So there's a lot of pushback that I get from people who don't want to hear this, right? Who think like this person, if I can just rear them free of OE, then I'll still be helping, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a tough conversation to have with somebody who's been doing this for a long time. And plus there's Facebook groups out there who are telling people that, yes, you're doing the right thing, keep doing it, you know, but it's
a lot of them, a lot of
them,
groups.
right? But they're not really based on science. It's really just based on emotions. And if you look closely at those groups, they're not really being, being guided by any kind of scientific rigor.
Yeah.
So yet again, another reason why I wanted to create my own group where we just talk about the science. And it can get, as I said, it can get challenging because people, they really like saving the monarchs. They really like saving the caterpillars. And so, yeah, that happens a lot.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, even me reading the stuff in your Facebook group, I sometimes get charged where I'm like, but
so
this is what the science says.
Okay, well, yeah, think about that reaction you're having. Why are you having that reaction? Is it because you think there's a problem with the science, or is it just because you really just don't want to hear it?
It's because I have dedicated a fair portion of my life to helping the monarchs, right, in my way, which was giving away milkweed. And it feels like that was all a waste. It was for nothing because it was all for a lie or something like that.
Yeah. So this is the part that, I don't want to say it's a lie, but this is the part that I am uncomfortable with this whole narrative around the monarchs being in trouble, because it doesn't really match what the evidence shows, right? In fact, if you look at their breeding range over all of North America, Canada and the US, and you look at where the monarchs occur in the summer, it's a massive, massive breeding range. There's monarchs in almost every state in the nation, almost every province in Canada. So that means they have breeding resources in all of those states and provinces. I've looked at these maps and compared them to other maps for other butterflies, other species. No other butterfly in North America can claim what the monarchs have, which is a massive, massive breeding resource around the entire continent. Their breeding range is continental, and no other butterfly even comes close to having that kind of breeding range. And so if you look at it that way, the monarchs are killing it.
Yeah.
They're crushing it.
They're doing a great job.
Yeah. And so that's what the evidence shows. And so to me, there's this tragic situation now where the public narrative is so far removed from what the real evidence shows. It's kind of depressing for me as a scientist, because here I am just trying to tell people what the science shows, and then I have to fight against what the media shows and people's feelings, and it shouldn't be that way. And in a perfect world, I should just be able to tell people, here's the graph, here's what the data shows. But it's not a perfect world, and it's getting harder each year to do this kind of thing.
Yeah.
I don't mean to rant a little bit about this, but this is kind of my life these days, being yelled at by little old ladies in Wisconsin.
Oh man. And they little old ladies don't pull their punches either. They'll just tell you the what for. Oh man.
So there's a fair amount of this controversy in the world of science. And it doesn't help that there are other scientists out there who are pushing a different agenda, right, than I am. Like who they have a couple of studies that they've shown where there is some declines. If you look at it at a certain data set in a certain time of year in a certain breeding part of the breeding range, yes, you can find declines if you look really, really hard. But then to extrapolate those small data sets to the larger picture, especially given the genetic data that I told you about, the breeding range, the breeding numbers, I mean, it's the data is pretty clear on what's happening in the summer. And so, my stance isn't really something that's abnormal, or I'm not the only one. Like there are other scientists out there who also can see these same numbers that I have, but I'm probably the only one who's willing to take the heat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's a lot of heat to take, 100%. And I mean, before we did this, I tried to find dissenting opinions and other studies and all this. I Googled it for, I don't even know, a couple hours trying to find something that would say you were wrong before I had you on my channel and was like, this is actually it.
Yeah.
And I couldn't find anything.
Well, that's good, I guess. I mean, I was going to say caution you against Googling. I mean, because
Yeah. And
when
I
you
may have
Google
just been
something,
using
that's
the wrong
not
keywords.
really research. You're Googling websites and comments, and Facebook groups, and you're Googling social media and blogs. I mean, ironically, I have a blog, but what comes up when you Google may or may not be the real thing. Especially these days, right?
Yeah.
And so it's hard to suss out like what's real and what's not these days online.
Yeah.
So I always sort of advocate, and that's why I have my group, for people, regular people, to try if they can to track down the original study. If you can access it, read the thing if you can, right? And try to make up your mind without any sort of bias or spin or anything or headlines, right? Try to read the actual science. And I've been banging my head against the table trying to get regular people to read the science themselves, because that's where the real knowledge comes from, and you can avoid all this bias. It's hard. That's a hard sell because no one wants to.
Well, they're hard reads sometimes.
It's hard reads, and it might be for me, but that's really where the real evidence lies. And so try to get away from Google as much as you can and get into like Google Scholar. Like that's a place where you can actually find.
I found all of your studies on there on Google Scholar. That was pretty fascinating. The color of the wings and all this stuff. I was like, I'd never even heard of that. That's amazing. So
yeah, good for you for doing that.
Yeah, thank you. All right, so let's take some audience questions real quick. So for everybody watching live, if you have any questions, put them in the comment below, and we will do our best to get through all of them and answer them. I have a couple questions from the video I posted on Friday that I'm going to add right now. One now and the other one later because it's on the other topic of the conversation. So this one, 4AF posted that they found on Google, and this is in quotes, new findings refute idea of migration mortality as a major reason for declining monarch population, end quote. In the article published August 6, 2020 in the journal Frontiers in Ecology and Evolution, the researchers show that the decline in the monarchs' overwintering numbers is not due to an increase in the deaths of monarchs during the migration, which I'm not sure if you're familiar with that particular article.
So that person just read the headlines.
Yeah.
They didn't actually read the study, and they didn't see that study was actually refuted months later by some other researchers, including Matt Forrester, who's like a statistical guru when it comes to butterfly data sets. And so they wrote a rebuttal article to follow up on that Frontiers article, and they pointed out that there were some errors in the way the stats were run in that first article. And the other thing they pointed out is that the way that that study was conducted, it was based on the reports of the tag recoveries in Mexico and how many there were each year. And they looked to see if there was a trend over time each year. And they didn't find one, and that was sort of the basics of their argument. But this rebuttal article pointed out those tag recoveries in Mexico are not, the searching effort in Mexico isn't any standardized way. And so in some years, there are more people looking for the monarch tags than others. And the search effort could be increasing now for all we know, because the locals actually get paid for all the tags that they find on the ground. So the search effort in Mexico is very random. And they pointed out in that rebuttal article that really, if you look at that, then that study doesn't really make sense. So there was a couple of problems with that study, but essentially the person who asked this question didn't pick up on that, didn't see that study had been refuted. and this happens a fair amount
Yeah.
in the world of science, especially with monarchs, is that a study will come out, make some headlines like that one did, and then the headlines will live on in the internet, right? They'll live on forever on the internet. But
Yeah.
then no one sees the small little rebuttal study that was posted later that shows, wait a minute, that first study was wrong. But then the headlines are still there, right? So ghost headlines are a big problem with the monarch research world.
Yeah. Yeah, I can imagine. Well, and I mean that there's good news is hardly as interesting and clickbaity as everything's the world's coming
Oh
to
my
an end,
God.
right?
So now that you said that, I should let people know that I recently submitted a new study that I did myself over the Christmas break, where I actually examined the news and the attention given to scientific studies of monarchs. And I looked back over 20 years at all of the studies of monarchs over the last 20 years to see which studies were getting more attention than others. And it was always the bad news studies, the studies showing declines or problems with pesticides or whatever it was. Those studies were making headlines around the world. The studies showing the good news never got any attention. And there have been a number of studies showing good news, but people like you never see them
Yeah, never
because
saw them.
they don't get it. There's no attention. And no one wants to share those studies, but the bad news studies get shared across the blogosphere, the internet, everywhere, right? So our own personal sort of human bias towards wanting to hear about the bad news is actually one of the things that's causing the monarch story to propagate about how the monarchs are in trouble. It's because of us.
Yep.
And also journalists. I mean, not to pick on them, but I've spoken to hundreds of journalists over the years about monarchs, and some of them will just flat out tell me, I'm not going to write a story showing good news for monarchs.
It's not as interesting. It doesn't
It's not as
sell.
interesting.
Yeah.
So
So
people
it
want to
sounds
hear it.
what it sounds like is we need like more of a clickbaity headline for the good news just to get people to click on it.
Yep. And yeah, so this is the other problem with the monarch news, the narrative about the doom and gloom.
Yeah.
It works,
Mm-hmm.
right? It gets people to read the study. It gets people to share the piece. It gets people to donate. It gets people. So that's the big problem here, and that's why conservation groups won't ever give this up, because it does the job, right? And so it's a sort of a losing battle for me on my end for telling people good news.
Well, and so I don't actually even remember if I had this question in there.
Yeah.
The conservation groups, you're probably going to mainly tell me that we don't need to donate to them anyway for the monarchs because it's not necessary. But is there a way to vet the ones that are doing a good job for any species? Like, how do you know?
I don't know. So if people are following my Facebook group, a month ago, I posted a day, one of my daily posts, and I had actually counted the number of conservation groups out there that I could find that were claiming to have an effort to save the monarchs.
Yeah.
And I counted over 40 different conservation groups in North America that are claiming to have a program to save the monarchs, where you can donate to them and they'll help to save the monarchs. So basically, so you can take that in two ways. One is that there's a lot of effort going on right now to save the monarchs, right? Lots of conservation groups are out there trying to do that. Or, I mean, a more pessimistic interpretation is that there's a lot of grifting going on, where people are telling you they're going to save monarchs if you give them money, right? Yeah. I don't really know the difference, and I don't know which ones are legit, which ones aren't. But that post was really telling for me just how many groups out there are trying to save the monarchs.
Yeah, well, and they're getting funding, because if they weren't getting funding, they wouldn't exist. They wouldn't be able to stay open.
Yeah, I've actually been kicked off of one Facebook group that was run by a conservation group, and they were promoting the Save the Monarchs campaign, and they were saying the monarchs are near extinction. And I just commented on the post. I said, here's the data, and it doesn't really show what you just said. and then they just removed me from the group.
I bet it came with a comment of, "You don't know what you're talking about. Go away,"
Yeah,
or something like
yeah.
that.
It happens all the time. And so it was a legitimate conservation group that just didn't want to hear what I was saying, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Your motive or your line doesn't fit their narrative, and it wouldn't help with their funding probably.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure there's groups out there that are legit, but and I have no idea how to tell which ones is which.
Yeah. Yeah.
So this sort of naturally dovetail into a discussion about what a person can do, right?
Mhm.
What a regular person can or should do for the monarchs.
Yes, and
Yeah.
that's the whole next section, but go
Okay.
ahead, and
Yeah.
you'll probably answer most of my questions just by talking. So
So, yeah, I do have a sort of a canned answer to that, and I would say there's nothing wrong with helping to make your yard insect friendly, right? I don't mean plant a pollinator garden.
Mhm.
I purposely am not calling it a pollinator garden, because here's the thing: when people plant like a butterfly garden or a pollinator garden, they somehow the message gets across to them that it's only for the butterflies. And then if a praying mantis dares to come in to their butterfly garden, people will kill that praying mantis on sight, right? And or if they see a stink bug killing one of their precious monarch babies, then they'll get rid of all the stink bugs that they have. Or people get really uptight when they plant a butterfly garden and they see their butterflies getting eaten.
Yeah.
But
That's
that's
the
what's
point.
supposed to happen, right? That's what's supposed to happen. So this is why I say make your yard insect and wildlife friendly. Friendly for all of the wildlife. Because if you think about it, insects are part of the food chain, including monarchs, right? And we need insects to feed our birds, to feed all of our snakes and whatever, right?
Yep,
And
it
so,
goes all the way up the food chain.
yeah,
It doesn't even
insects are
stop there.
tasty little snacks. And so think of your insect garden, your insect friendly yard as Mama Bird's grocery store, right? She's going to get those caterpillars that you raised in your backyard, and she's going to feed them to her babies, right?
Yeah.
It may or may not be monarchs, but it'll be other critters out there.
Yeah.
And so I always advocate, people can help by making their yard insect friendly, but then also allowing nature to be nature, to not have, you don't have to get in and manage it. This is where people go wrong. They try to stop the monarchs from being eaten, or they try to remove those nasty predators or what have you. And so, yeah, there's nothing wrong with making your yard insect friendly, but then just sort of stepping back and watching it all happen in real time. Also, people can contribute to some of the actual data that is being contributed that allows scientists like me to actually come up with some of these studies. There are many volunteer groups out there where you can go out and you can count butterflies or monarchs, and you can contribute data to them that helps us to answer some of these questions about the monarchs and the other insects as well.
Yeah.
So those are two things right there that people can do to help.
That's awesome.
But neither of those is really sort of monarch focused, and so that's almost by design, because I kind of think since the breeding evidence shows the monarchs are doing pretty much okay, and there's evidence that our unintended management it can be harmful. I usually tell people we need more of a hands-off approach to the monarchs. And so really, my message to people who want to save the monarchs is don't. Let the monarchs live in your yard as they would in nature. You can plant your butterfly garden or a nature space or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
And you don't even have to plant something. Like I always say, let a space of your yard grow naturally. Just let it grow. Even if there's weeds, I mean, I guess if there's non-native.
If there's native weeds. Yeah.
You'd be amazed at how many bugs you can attract in just a wild space in your yard.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. One of my things that I've been working on for several years is the pushback I get on wild gardens, native gardens, pollinator gardens, stuff like that, is that they're messy or they're ugly. And so I've been trying to show people they don't have to be. they can be gorgeous. And so that's what I'm doing with my yard is trying to do all the things. I'm leaving the leaves, I'm mulching with wood chips, and I'm planting natives. And it's still young, so it's still very small. But when it fills in, it's going to be absolutely stunning. And there won't be a weed in sight. There won't be any mess. Like, it can still be absolutely gorgeous, and it should be good enough for your HOA. Thank you.
Well, that's one way to go about it. I would argue that, there's no such thing as an ugly garden, right?
Yeah.
You got to be ugly, and that's what the butterflies want, right?
Right. Yeah, exactly.
If you think about it, and there's actual research on this, a weedy garden with lots of tall weeds around the butterfly plants are actually better for the butterfly caterpillars because
they hide them
hidden, right?
Yeah.
And so, you really don't want to have your butterfly plants, whatever species you're attracting, to be exposed, right? Because then literally the caterpillars are exposed. But then on the other hand, you don't want to discourage predation because that's kind of a nature's thing.
Kind of the point. Yeah. Well, I'm just thinking maybe that's why I've never had a monarch lay eggs on my milkweed, aside from the fact that I'm in Spokane and we hardly ever see monarchs. But I did get one a couple of years ago. It was the first monarch I ever saw in Spokane, and it visited my milkweed. I was so happy. Oh.
Yeah, you're in an area that may or may not normally have monarchs to begin with, right?
Yeah, we're like right on the edge of their migration path, so it's possible for them to be here, but it's unlikely, and so we don't see them very much.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. This is an excellent discussion. Okay, I'm just going through my questions because you answered most of them.
Okay.
The next one was, should we plant milkweed at all? Like, if we can guarantee that this is a native species, it's not tropical and it's not any of the other non-native milkweeds.
So
we can have it, but not for the monarchs specifically. It's for the ecology as a whole, is what I'm hearing.
Yeah. So this is a tough question because I actually argue that there are places in North America where we really shouldn't be planting any milkweed. And this is where it gets really controversial, but places like Florida, Southern California, Southern Texas even are places where the OE parasite is getting out of control. And in those places, I've been arguing that really no milkweed in your backyard would be better, because if you do have milkweed in your backyard, like in Florida, you're basically just turning your backyard into an infection producing factory, even if it's native. Even if it's native milkweed, there's so many OE infected monarchs flying around in Florida that they're going to drop their OE spores on any native milkweed that they find, and thereby turn those caterpillars into more infected butterflies. So more milkweed in Florida means more infected butterflies in Florida. And so in Florida and also Southern California, I've been arguing no milkweed, it would actually be safer for people. Because OE is on the rise across the board, and that's not a good thing for the fall migration either.
Right.
So this is really something that I pointed this out years ago, that OE is probably the most, it's one of the conservation issues we really should be paying attention to more often, because it is increasing. And the increase, there was a study on this a couple of years ago, the increase in OE coincides exactly with when the Save the Monarchs campaign started back in the early 2000s. Exactly.
Wow.
And so it's unfortunate, but this is a study that really solidified my view that a hands-off approach to the monarchs is actually better, because our management of them, our saving them, could actually be causing the very problems we're seeing in the fall migration.
Yeah. Our involvement and our helping is actually causing.
So getting back to that original question, I would say to a person who asked that question, you need to know what your OE levels are in your region before you decide to plant milkweed. How do you do that? You either consult with some research that's been done, and there has been some research. There's links in my blog and in the Facebook group. But then people can also catch their own monarch butterflies in their own yard and test them themselves using a basic microscope and some Scotch tape.
Yeah.
And a butterfly net. And so if you suspect you live in an area that is high OE prevalence, I would encourage people to test their own monarchs, because that will tell you whether or not you're helping or not. So if all of your butterflies that you test end up being infected, that's a bad sign, right?
Yeah.
That means something really bad's happening, and you probably shouldn't have milkweed to encourage that.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think as we go on, more and more gardeners should be doing this, learning how to test monarchs for OE, and especially out west where you are, like in the west, OE is much more prevalent in the east, and it always has been. And so that's something that's it's a really important thing that people should be doing.
Yeah.
Can't
I
stress
found
enough.
I found a fantastic step-by-step article while I was researching for this, and very simple. Like, so
It's really not that hard to do.
no, it doesn't seem that hard to do. That catching the butterfly sounds like harder a harder thing to do than actually testing it. So real quick, for anybody that doesn't know what OE is, it's a protozoan parasite that affects monarchs. It weakens them, and it can deform their wings and make it harder for them to fly, and they don't migrate as successfully. And it's
Yeah,
very, very contagious.
yeah. It doesn't always deform their wings. That's an important thing that people miss. A monarch butterfly can emerge looking completely normal and still be infected. And that's where the problems lie. And people think they see a butterfly in their backyard that looks fine, but it's really infected.
Yeah.
And so you really can't tell unless you catch them and test them with a microscope.
Is it when they come out all deformed, is it just they have a higher load of the parasite, or do we even
Yeah,
know?
usually.
Okay.
Yeah,
So
the
that's
higher
just
the
when it
load,
gets
the
so
more
bad.
damage that occurs.
So if you get one that's deformed in your home rearing operation, you know that your whole operation is infected most
You
likely.
better check that monarch to see if it's infected, and if it is, that means most of your other butterflies are probably infected, even if they look normal.
Yeah, and then so I know this is going to be super controversial, but what do you do with them when they're infected?
That's a good question. I would argue that they need to be euthanized.
That's
Some
what all
people
the articles
argue
say.
that if you think it occurred naturally, if it was a naturally occurring infection, then they could be released back into the wild because it's a naturally occurring parasite. But then in places like Florida, we've already increased the OE loads so drastically that I think we're beyond that stage.
Yeah.
And I think given the dangers that the monarchs face during the fall migration, the last thing we should be doing is adding more infections to the mix to further decrease their migration success. So I always argue euthanize them.
Yeah. Yeah. Which, God, that's heartbreaking, but
Yeah.
it's the right thing to do.
Well, I mean, if you don't rear the monarchs, you don't have to worry about this, right?
Right.
So another reason not to rear them.
Yeah. I don't know if I'd be able to. Like, it would just.
And some people can't do it, and then they end up releasing that infected butterfly because they didn't have the heart to put it down.
Yeah.
And then they come up with all these excuses for why they had to release it anyway. But then that infected butterfly is then going to lay eggs if it's a female, and all of her progeny will be infected.
Yeah.
So that infected butterfly you released is going to then lead to dozens, if not hundreds, of more infected larvae.
Yeah. And if it's a male, when it mates with the female, it's going to get her infected, and it's the same problem, right?
Sort of, yeah. Yeah, the males can transfer it, and females can transfer it during mating. But yeah, OE is something that every monarch enthusiast should be aware of and know how to test for.
Yeah.
I see we're getting close on the time limit here.
Yeah, we should probably get going. Okay, so
one more question, maybe.
Yeah, there was. You've already covered that. You've already covered that.
I mean, maybe I can put in a gratuitous plug here. If people really want to know more information, feel free to join my group. I mean,
yes,
that's what it's for. It's for people to get real information from real experts and to cut through all the jargon and the bias and clickbait.
Yep, and I've got that linked in the description below, folks, so make sure to check that out. Okay, one more of my questions, and I have one more audience question, and then we'll wrap up.
Okay.
So pollinator highways. I've heard all the opinions on that. They seem like a great idea. For anybody who doesn't know, when you have a long stretch of highway that's usually just full of grass and weeds, some municipalities have been mowing that down and overseeding with native and pollinator plants, which creates space for all the pollinators to live and breed and survive. But it's right next to traffic. And so I've thought, are we just luring them to a deadly buffet? Like, what is this? And so, I mean, I've talked to one expert who said it's still a net positive. But Andy, what's your opinion on this?
Terrible idea.
Yeah.
There, all of the research that's been done, the vast majority of the research shows that when you have pollinator gardens next to a highway, you get increasing mortality of insects on the highway. You don't necessarily see it on your car windshields or the grill because the insects just disintegrate, right?
Yeah.
But every time there's been a study, whether it's been on monarchs or insects or bees or whatever, where researchers walk the highway margins and they count the number of dead butterflies or insects or whatever, they always find massive amounts of mortality. And you can easily extrapolate that because you can sort of calculate how many insects there were that died per kilometer of road. And then if you know how many roads there are, how many kilometers, you can then extrapolate those numbers. And people have done that for monarchs, for insects, for a lot of other critters. And the numbers are astronomical. For monarchs, it's like millions and millions of monarch butterflies are killed each fall during the fall migration by roads, by getting hit by cars. And so do we really want to lure them closer to the roads by putting a flower next to the road?
Yeah, so it's well-meaning effort that has all these drastic, terrible consequences.
You know who had one of the best studies on this? Doug Tallamy. He actually wrote a study. He wrote a paper showing that if you add insect habitat next to a road, then you get increased insect mortality.
Mm-hmm.
And he showed that if you add it in the median, it's even worse. It's double the amount of mortality.
Is there like a distance that would be safe? Like if it was 10 meters or 100, probably 100 meters away would probably be fine. But like,
so, well, the other thing that people don't realize about these highways, and I've actually studied this in my lab.
Yeah,
they're loud.
Yeah,
really loud. And that noise, that artificial noise, actually could stress the insects and cause them to be developmentally stunted. Right. So we see the pretty butterflies on the side of the road, thinking they look fine. Right.
Yeah.
But I've actually measured their heart rates, and the heart rates are really high. Right.
Wow.
Other people have done other sort of physiological measurements of butterflies and other insects next to roads. And so we need to be looking beyond simply, are the butterflies there? We now need to be looking at, are they developing normally, right? So there's all this other stuff that we haven't really considered when it comes down to the roads. It's not just the distance, but it's the chemicals in the highways. It's the noise. It's the constant disruption. I mean, all of those things we know harm birds next to highways and other vertebrates. And so my research is now showing that a lot of invertebrates could be being harmed simply by being next to a road,
just by being there. Well, and so two thoughts I have on this is if we have insects in the medians or next to the roads, that's going to attract birds, which that's a traffic hazard. If you hit a bird, that's you can break your windshield, right? Cause an accident, all kinds of things. And then the other bit is, so what should we plant next to highways? Should we just leave it grass?
Grass.
Okay.
It's no one wants to hear that, right?
No.
Again, it's another one of these things where people really like this idea, right?
Yeah. Well, it seems like a great idea. Like we're supposed to plant more habitat and get rid of grass, right?
There are people out there who firmly think that those areas end up producing more butterflies or insects than they kill. But and the evidence on that is really shaky, right? And so a lot of this comes down to like just a basic guess. And so we're basically performing a giant experiment with these roadside pollinator gardens, hoping for the best, right? But we could very well be increasingly harming butterflies or causing them stress or what have you. So I argue that to be safe, right, for the insects, we should be focusing elsewhere, not next to highways. Like country roads, maybe I can see that, like quiet country roads, but not on highways.
Yeah, I totally get it. Okay, good stuff. Okay, let's move on. This is my last audience question from the video I posted on Friday. And this one, he wrote it she, I guess, wrote it very technically. So I'm going to do my best to read this. Debbie A.M. Jackson wrote, It's my understanding from Dr. Chip Taylor that migration cues of SASN 57 degrees, so I don't even know what that is,
Sun angle.
sun angle solar noon, is the main trigger for migration with or without tropical milkweed. Also, tropical milkweed dies at first frost, so it cannot impede migration at latitudes, say, north of Texas. I test all my wild-found monarchs for OE after eclosure, 0% infections for 2024 with about 100 samples. These warnings you promote are really only valid for states in the very south or along the coastline where frost doesn't kill tropical milkweed. By the way, I have about 6 native Asclepias genomes in addition to tropical milkweed in my gardens, and try to look at research of doctors David James, D. Rude, Oberhauser, Taylor, and others not associated with U of Georgia before you decide who to believe. The severe drought in Texas and northern MX, I don't even know what state that is.
Mexico.
Mexico, okay. In 2023, decimated the nectar sources for them as they migrated to the sanctuaries, leaving them too thin to survive, whereas your source, AD, so she means you, says the low population was due to the collision with cars and AC interference, so tropical milkweed interference.
So yeah, that's here.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack in that comment, and this is obviously a dissenter who doesn't like what you're saying.
Yeah, and this brings up another problem that we see now in our business, is that people can do this dial a scientist game, and if they don't like what you're selling, they'll just find somebody else who will tell them something different, maybe tell them what they want to hear. Yeah. And in our business, there are people out there, Dr. Taylor, who has always argued that tropical milkweed isn't a problem, and he hasn't really studied tropical milkweed, right? The idea that tropical milkweed is not harming the migration is really just not based on the evidence. The idea that the tropical milkweed would die during the frost misses a lot of the real problems that it causes, right? Yeah. So it can be in leaf for months, for weeks later than the native milkweed in the fall, right? Mm-hmm. And so that in itself, it can hinder the fall migration. Yeah. So it prolongs the breeding season for the fall for the monarchs, which then allows those caterpillars on the tropical milkweed to emerge much later than they should, and they sort of start the migration with falling behind from the outset. The other thing about tropical milkweed is that people don't realize that it actually causes changes to the monarch's physiology if they grow up eating tropical milkweed. So caterpillars reared on tropical milkweed end up having a metabolic rate that is much too high for a successful fall migration. And so
it's like a kid eating sugar.
Basically, we don't really know the exact reason, but there was a study done a few years ago that showed that if you compare tropical milkweed to other native milkweeds, the caterpillars raised on tropical milkweed end up being adult butterflies with the wrong metabolism for migration. So even just growing the monarchs on tropical milkweed, regardless of whether or not there's a frost, caterpillars reared on tropical milkweed do not end up being butterflies that are suited for a fall migration. So yet again, another reason that the tropical milkweed is interfering with the fall migration itself. And so we don't want more caterpillars growing up on tropical milkweed because it makes them not able to migrate. And that's just one of the pieces of evidence. There's other research showing that they have stunted wings if they grow up on tropical milkweed. And there's some other work showing that they have paler, less red wings from my work. And redness in the monarch world means better migration. So if their wings are paler, if they grow up eating tropical milkweed, that means they're not going to be good at migrating. So lots of evidence here showing that we really shouldn't be growing tropical milkweed.
Yeah.
Because it's not helping the fall migration.
Yeah.
And again, that's exactly what we're seeing now. Problems with the fall migration. Exactly what we're seeing.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. We got a couple more comments coming in. Natural selection doesn't apply to the defenseless immature stages of monarch development. And then this is a one-sided interview. Every point being made is disputed by other science, which you talked about earlier in the video. I'm guessing this person joined recently, but I do still thank you, sir or madam, for your comments, because that's what this conversation is supposed to be about.
it can be hard to sort through all the information as the regular person.
Mm-hmm.
But as I said, people are free to join my group if they're willing to learn about the science.
Yes.
Like that's a key thing. Like if they're willing to learn, like some people join the group just to be combative, right? And to say, well, you're wrong because of this and this and this. And then, those people may or may not last in the group. But
Yeah.
I try to make sure that the lines of communication are open in my group. And so if people really want to come and they really have an open mind and they really want to learn about what the science shows, feel free to join.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. Well, Andy, is there anything you want to say before we wrap up? Anything else?
Please don't send me hate mail.
Yeah, you get enough already. Oh my goodness.
I do. Yeah. It shouldn't be that way, but I do.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing this wonderful news that the monarchs are actually okay. It's amazing.
Yeah. Thank you for having this forum. And this is a great way to sort of get some of this message across.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And I hope that it's viewed by lots of people. I may send you messages to ask clarifying questions of people that leave comments later from, when it's posted later. But in the meantime, thank you so much for giving us your time and sharing this fascinating research, Andy.
All right. No problem. Thank you for having me on your show.
Yeah, you're so welcome. Thank you.
See you later.
See ya. Bye-bye.